Okay, welcome back. I hope you guys are understanding the chapter and you're enjoying this as much as I am. One of the reasons I actually fell in love with economics was because of monetary policy and trying to understand it again. Guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Send me an email, talk to the SI, or just come to my office, okay? Now, the final thing we'll look at in this chapter is basically looking at policy strategies in terms of monetary policy, right? So how does the Fed decide actually to set the federal funds rate at, let's say, 5% or let's say 10%? Currently, the federal funds rate is at 0.25%, okay? Right. Now, the Fed actually employs two strategies, right? And one is more common than the other. And we're going to be looking at one in more detail than the first one because the first one is rarely used by the Fed, okay? The first one is what we call the inflation rate targeting, okay? So the federal funds rate is set based on how the Fed thinks inflation rate should be. And the Fed basically makes an announcement as to how the inflation rate or what the inflation rate target is going to be for the economy, okay? And the second one or the last one is basically what we call the Taylor rule. Now we'll look at the Taylor rule in more detail. So this was named after the economist who actually found it. His name is John Taylor from Stanford University. Okay. So these are the sort of two rules most central banks decide to use, and that's what the Fed decides to use. Okay. Right. Majority of the time, the Fed is actually employing the Taylor rule instead of the inflation targeting rule. Now, with the inflation targeting rule, the central bank or the Federal Reserve basically comes out to make a public commitment as to what its inflation target is and how basically it's going to achieve that inflation target. Okay, so for example, the Fed will come out and say, hey, in December, we want inflation rate to be 2%. And it basically tells the public or it basically tells the citizens of the country how it's going to achieve that. Or the Federal Reserve will come out and say, hey, in January, we basically want the inflation rate to be 3%. And it basically would tune its monetary policy towards achieving that goal. Okay, so that does not depend on what is happening in the economy. It basically depends on the Fed making a public commitment to basically manage inflation expectations. Okay, so to actually look at inflation rate targeting, the Fed is basically going to achieve an explicit inflation target. Okay, so for example, they want the inflation rate to be 1.5%. They basically state that and they try to achieve it. Okay, and they basically explain what policies in terms of setting the federal funds rate and essentially increasing or decreasing money supply to basically achieve that target. Now, majority of countries tend to use inflation targeting because majority of countries' central banks basically are just set about just to monitor inflation rate, okay, and just to control the inflation rate. Now, inflation targeting has been used by most banks since the mid 90s and early 90s, and most advanced countries like Denmark, Canada, United Kingdom, and most of the European Union countries use inflation rate targeting, okay? The United States basically doesn't use inflation rate targeting. It actually uses what we look at next, which is basically the Taylor rule. Now, the Taylor rule is basically another way to basically set the federal funds rate. Okay, so the inflation targeting basically uses what the federal will call a commitment in terms of what inflation should be and set the federal funds rate accordingly. Now, the Taylor rule is basically dependent on what current conditions are and basically what the federal funds rate should be given current conditions. Okay. Right. Now, this rule was proposed by Stanford University economist known as John Taylor in 1993. And he was famous for basically bringing this rule out, or he was the first person to basically bring this rule out in terms of setting the federal funds rate. Now, he was so popular, or this rule was so popular and so good in terms of actually determining what the federal funds rate should be, to the point where it was actually named after him. He's also the guy who actually invented what we call the staggered contract model, which is basically used in predicting wages and prices in the economy. He hasn't won a Nobel Peace Prize in economics yet, but we hope he does very soon. Okay, now calling the federal funds rate FFR, the inflation rates basically INF, and the output gap GAP, and all these are in percentages, by the way. The Taylor rule formula, and you don't need to know how to derive this formula, okay? John Taylor has already done that for you. Well, the Taylor rule formula is basically giving us the federal funds rate should equal to plus the inflation rate, which is current in the economy, plus 0.5 times the inflation rate minus 2 plus 0.5 times the output gap. Okay, right. So that is what the federal funds rate should be according to the Taylor rule. Okay, so basically it should equal 2 plus the inflation rate plus 0.5 times two standard deviations from the inflation rate plus half the output gap. Now, let's look at an example. Suppose the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is basically using the Taylor rule. In 2018, it set its federal funds rate, which the Bank of New Zealand basically calls the official cash rate, at 4% a year. If the inflation rate in New Zealand is basically 2% a year, now what is this output gap? Okay, so we've been given this sort of like preamble or scenario where we know that the Central Bank of New Zealand is basically using the Taylor rule. We've been given the federal funds rate basically set. We've been given the inflation rate. Now we need to know what the output gap is. Now, first of all, before we actually get to the answer, what really is the output gap? Remember, the output gap is basically actual GDP minus potential GDP. Okay, so how actual GDP basically deviates from potential GDP. Okay, so that essentially is the output gap. Okay, right. Now, given the Taylor rule, how do we find the output gap? Well, it's pretty simple. We know that the Taylor rule essentially, we know that the Taylor rule essentially is given by this equation where we have 2 plus inflation rate plus 0.5 times inflation rate minus 2 plus 0.5 times the output gap should give you the federal funds rate. Okay, so now we have the federal funds rate in our question being 4. We have 2 plus the inflation rate, which we said was 2, plus 0.5 times the inflation rate, which was basically 2, minus 2, plus 0.5 times the output gap. We don't know what the output gap is, and we're trying to find that. Okay, so to simplify things, we have 4 equals 4, right? Because you have 2 plus 2, which is basically 4. You have 0.5 times 2 minus 2, which is basically 0, okay? Because this will give you 0. So 0.5 times 0 is basically 0, plus 0.5 times the output gap. Now, basically, we solve for the output gap, okay? So we have 0 equals 0.5 times the output gap. We divide both sides by 0.5, and we find out the output gap in this example is basically 0. Okay, so now if the output gap is 0, what does that mean? It means that actual GDP in New Zealand actually, sorry for the pun. Okay, actual GDP in New Zealand is equal to potential GDP. So the economy is basically producing at its maximum level. Okay, so that's the ideal rate to be producing. Okay, now let's look at another example. Suppose that in macro land, the equilibrium real interest rate is 2% per year, inflation is 2.5%, and the output gap is 1%. Using the Taylor rule, what is the federal funds rate? So now using the Taylor rule, again, we're going to go through the same procedure. We have the Taylor rule formula, which is given over here. Okay, we know that essentially we have the inflation rate in this example being 2.5, and we have the output gap being 1%. Okay, so we just plug our numbers in and basically solve for the federal funds rate. If you simplify things, you have 2 plus 2.5 plus 0.25. How do we get 0.25? Well, that is simply 2.5 minus 2, which is 0.5, times 0.5, and you should get 0.25 plus 0.5. Okay, you should simplify this further and you should get 5.25%. Okay, so the federal funds rate in this economy would be 5.25%. Again, guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Now, see if you can actually work on this on your own. Okay, suppose that the inflation rate is 3% and the output gap is negative 1%. Assuming that the equilibrium real interest rate is 2%, what target should the Federal Reserve set for the federal funds rate if the Taylor rule is used? So see if you can actually work on this. Okay, so at this moment, I ask you to pause the video and see if you can actually work on this and get the right answer. If you work on this and get the right answer, you should get 5%. Okay, so the right answer is basically 5%. Okay, right. So basically, I'll end the chapter over here. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. And I'll see you next time. Take care and thank you.